Good day, my name is Christy van der Merwe, reporting for Creamer Media's Polity. In January 1994, Peter Harris was appointed the head of the monitoring division for the Independent Electoral Commission. He has written the book Birth about the subject. We speak to him today. Peter, the book is essentially a very historical account about a very specific time in South Africa's history. When did you write this book, and how long did it take you, and how did you go about collating all that historical information?
It probably took me about 2.5 years to write, and you know, during the course of that election, because in a sense I was inside it, inside the Independent Electoral Commission, you know, I kept pretty detailed notes of my engagements and meetings and so on, and then there were the sort of IEC records. I also did a lot of interviews with people who had worked at a lot of the IEC commissioners from the '94 election. And I went through a lot of historical sort of data and records, archives, TRC records. So a lot of the right-wing stuff, in fact, was got from TRC records and their own confessions.
You're writing a book about the past, but you're writing it in the present tense. As a reader, it's quite a difficult experience being put into that moment, in the situation. What was it like as a writer, writing it, going through, almost reliving the whole process again?
Well, it was reliving it in a sense, you know, because it works according to a strict timeline. So it's told in the first person. You know, I am at the IEC on, you know, or it is Tuesday the 26th of April, and so on. So, you know, I suppose it's almost sort of quite cathartic in some ways, because it was a very traumatic time. A lot of violence, a lot of stress, a lot of trauma. And that was difficult at times, actually. And then, of course, you know, one forgets, you know, in a sense, and it's one of the reasons I called it Birth, because in a sense, firstly, it was the birth of our democracy, but secondly, you know, from what I understand of a birth, at least in terms of a woman giving birth, is that there's, you know, terrible pain and trauma and blood, and then there's this wonderful joy as a human being comes into the world. And in a sense, I think we remember that election and the miracle of our birth as a democracy, but we've forgotten just how difficult a birth it was and how traumatic it was.
The subtitle to the book is The Conspiracy to Stop the '94 Elections. Did you ever truly think that there was a point where this transition might not happen, that there were forces powerful enough to stop this, or do you think it was something that was unstoppable?
I think in many ways it was unstoppable, but, you know, there's certain events that had to happen for it to take place, and one of them was the election, which is why it became such a target for right-wing forces and for conspiracies, and why ultimately, you know, someone managed to hack into the computer system and change some of the results, which was later corrected, of course. But while one might say it's an unstoppable force, you know, you can stop most things. And if we hadn't had that election, it would have been stopped. It might have still have happened later, of course, but it would have delayed it for a while, and who knows what could have happened then.
At one point in the book, you mention that there are swathes of the country not in a position to run a bath, never mind an election. Tell us a little bit about the logistical issues in trying to organize this election. Was it logistics or was it spooks? Tell us about that.
There were conspiracies and spook theories and stuff like that, but, you know, the logistics of putting together an election in just over 3 months for 22 million people, when, you know, the previous elections, which had been for whites only, were essentially for just over 3 million people. This election was for 22 million potential voters. So it was on a scale that this country had never seen before. And then it was held in areas in which there'd never been an election. So in vast areas of the Transkei, for example, there was no infrastructure or lights or water or roads to get to particular places. So it was an immense task. And then, of course, there were whole areas of the country that were actively ill-disposed or not prepared to let an election happen on their territory. So you had KwaZulu, for example, who was saying, you know, no election will take place in the territory of KwaZulu. The Ciskei said the same for a period of time. Botswana, Chief Mangopi said, you know, there won't be an election here. You know, and then, of course, you know, you had imploding homelands, you know, where there was just virtually no administration. And in some places, complete anarchy, which is what ultimately happened in both Ciskei and Bophuthatswana. So the logistics of putting it together were immense.
And it happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of thing. You know, ultimately, it happened in spite of all of the difficulties and the challenges and the incompetence in some areas in the IEC. And, you know, the threats by the right wing and the bombs and the conspiracies, it still happened. The people wanted it to happen. That was the remarkable thing.
You also note in the book that there are times when there are very different people coming from different sides for the national interest. Tell us about that. What was it like seeing these elements from an old regime coming together to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, it was exceptional, and it was quite moving at times to, you know, see former enemies sort of sitting down across the table and saying, right, this is what we need to do together. You know, so you'll get someone like Tele Moema, who was, you know, a very senior ANC intelligence guy who'd spent a lot of time in Angola in the camps, working with, you know, Admiral Dries Patter, you know, who had been chief of the Navy at one point, I think he was, and also a very senior intelligence guy. And they were sitting down and saying, right, how are we going to deal with these intelligence threats? And, you know, they were both pretty impressive people, and that happened a lot. I mean, there was the one sort of example that springs to mind, because I saw it. Their office was quite close to mine, and they used to share an office every day and come to work and work late and crack jokes, and that was exceptional, just seeing the people saying, we're going to pull this thing together.
Do you think we see enough of this today?
I think one sees it, but one would like to see more. But I think one sees a lot of initiatives. You know, I think the latest World Cup was an example of the country pulling together. You know, just saying we're going to make this thing happen, despite all the odds and despite all the skepticism and having Australia as a plan B. You know, now people realize actually that was just an embarrassing joke.
The book is full of very interesting anecdotes and people and situations. What for you stands out as one of the highlights of this whole process?
I think the voting day kind of stands out for most people who were of an age at that point, you know, to vote or to have a consciousness. I think that was a very moving day. That stands out. But, you know, there were good times and bad times, and, you know, we're all pulling together. And I mean, there's one incident in the book where, you know, Solveig Piper, who was the head of administration, you know, for her birthday, someone organized a stripper, and, you know, they brought in the cake, and the cake set off the alarm system, and you know, the sprinklers were kind of pouring water down, and the alarm was going off, and the next minute, you know, these kind of SWAT team guys from the army kind of come in, you know, kind of thing like that, and, you know, they find people having some fun. So there were a lot of humorous times, kind of, you know, release of tension kind of thing. Which were great, you know, and memorable, but, you know, interspersed amongst great times of great stress.
Is there anything else about this book that you think is important for us to know?
Well, I think there are a lot of lessons well, not lessons, but, you know, one is, you know, as a writer, in a sense, you don't want to point people to particular conclusions. You want them to read between the lines, and I think that, you know, one of the issues that I think is important is that our democracy is still a very fragile thing, but a lot of pain and suffering went into making that birth happen, and we need to make sure we protect it.
We know that you're busy every day, but what can we expect from you now?
You know, this is my hobby, you know, so I have a day job, and, you know, so I'd like to, you know, I mean, I love writing, so, you know, like some people like sculpting or gardening or cooking or whatever, you know, I like writing, so I will write another book. I just don't know what it is at the moment. I'll have to see. Maybe it's a novel, maybe it's non-fiction. People have said, is this part of a trilogy, because I've written In a Different Time, which was my first book. Yeah, I'm not sure.